here at the Venezuela event deal with humanitarian crisis, the principle of humanitarian intervention, or the principle of the responsibility to intervene, as well as topics related to human rights violations and oppression of the Venezuelan people.
Citizenry. Yesterday in Maracaibo, the second largest city in Venezuela, which is in the west, formerly the heart of the oil sector of Venezuela, had such a severe lack of food that the population took to mass looting of any grocery store that they could get their hands on, particularly targeting places where there was ice, so that anyone who had medication that needed to be kept refrigerated so that it could be effective, antibiotic, entirely consistent with the responsibility to protect, because the R2P only envisages the use of force when there can be a mandate issued by the Security Council of the Security by Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and the chances of that happening in Venezuela when Russia and China are on the Security Council are very low. In any case, if there ever was to be military force applied to protect the population of Venezuela, the conduct of the military operations would have to be held to a standard that the population would be protected. I have been in 3 theaters of combat where
I want to be not too much extended, but I remember in April 2016 when I brought the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Assembly in front of the Senate. And after the section when Florido and that group had to speak, after them come the opportunity of the Global Affairs to speak. And I remember Renella and Rachel said, we saw what happened in Jordania, we saw what happened in Somalia, we saw what happened in Rwanda, and we know and we can identify the way and the path and what is going to be the end. When we're going to act before that is late. I remember, and that was April 2016. Today, April 2016, the Senator Raynell and Rachel.
Raynell Andrechuk, yes.
Yeah, she asked that to Sean Sunderland. He was in Global Affairs in that time. I was there with them. And now we are in 2019, probably almost 3 years after. I know that the situation in Venezuela is really complex, and the regime find a way to move between the one and the second pillar of the R2P. They know how to navigate the establishment, and I know that, for example, one of the requirements of the R2P is the army forces kill the population, and it's not what is happening in Venezuela, because they are using paramilitary forces. They are using police, they are using forces to control the order control.
Yes.
They are they create a gray zone, and they try to erase the different lines to divide the step to go forward with the R2P. And the other situation that we have in Venezuela is I heard any meeting of the United Nations Organization of American States. Actually, I'm one of the advisor from the Venezuelan community before every Lima group, every one of them. And I know that everybody complains about an intervention, that we have to respect the sovereignty of Venezuela, but the elephant in the room always is we already are under an intervention. We have the regime of Cuba inside Venezuela. We have, it's proof, it's internationally proved that we have agents of Venezuela operating and controlling the Venezuelan army. And they are the ones who are torture of our military members in the places, in Sevin, in the La Tumba, all the places, the Tom, all of them. Because I work with Tamara Suhu, the one who denounced the regime of Maduro in front of the ICC. and I have to work with her here to make Canada, thank you, join us to denounce Venezuela in front of the ICC. And it's something that nobody wants to comment. We have the proof to the presence of the cell of Hezbollah in Venezuela, training, changing identities, and for me, anytime when I heard in the international community that, no, it's because the United States are behind the oil of Venezuela. No, we want to prevent the invasion of Venezuela. No, it's not true. We already was taken from those government, outside government. We are not asking for international intervention. We don't want a war in Venezuela. We need to rescue our people, because the Venezuelan, I know that because I follow you for a long time, I know that you visit my country many times before being the ambassador. You went with your backpack, and I know that you love my country, and I saw you when you cried for my country. But we really are asking for rescue the people. We don't have we are not Mohajims. We don't have the experience to be aggressive people. We need to be safe. I remember in the two previous meetings talking with Alan Cullen, and Alan, Alessa, what do you think about the situation? And I told him I know that it's probably tough what I said to him. I said, Alan, if the international community is still waiting and they still asking for dialogue and soft situation, maybe you have to prepare a lot of black bags for the bodies in my country, because this is going to be the end if we're still waiting. I really appreciate what you are doing, and we know that we need it's a coalition of countries to help to save Venezuela.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I traveled to the Rio Cabra in 2007, the moment in which I felt in love with the country. So I think you made three really important points, and I'd like to respond to each of them. You mentioned that, if I understand correctly, by saying that in 2016, Senator Andrew Chuck was saying there's a path to cases in which R2P is required, and here we are 3 years later. There is one important condition that has been met in that time. R2P, I didn't mention this in my remarks, but R2P is to be invoked in cases when there's genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and I can't remember what the fourth one is. There has been, and you would know this because you referred to the process, there has been an authoritative report done by the OAS that has documented crimes against humanity in Venezuela, and particularly in extrajudicial killings, political murders, with more than 8,900 cases. So in the opinion of this esteemed international legal panel, which includes Canada's own Irwin Cotler's, there have definitely been crimes against humanity committed. And so that is a prerequisite for invoking R2P. If that was not the case, it would be very difficult, I think, at this point, because you'd have to build an argument for how the denial of the right to food and the right to medicine consists of crimes against humanity. Probably true, but it's less convincing than 8,900 cases of people that have been murdered because of their political activity in the country. Secondly, I did not mention the fact that there already is a foreign military intervention, and I apologize. There certainly are foreign forces that are operating in Venezuelan territory. You didn't mention this, but there's certainly documentation that there are Russian paramilitary forces operating in the country, possibly as sort of a Praetorian Guard of Maduro. It's not entirely clear. And then, of course, there's the presence of many Cuban military and intelligence officials. My view is that in opposing foreign military intervention, it should be the insistence should be that existing foreign militaries and foreign intelligence office that have a presence should be expelled from the country, and that no new country should be sending military personnel either. This would not be directed just against the prospect of the U.S. potentially coming in, but the foreign intervention into the domestic affairs of Venezuela, which is already taking place. And third, I think what I'd say reason that I'm insisting on this focus on humanitarian assistance and invoking R2P and trying to find a position that could enjoy consensus across the regional community and possibly the international community, but more likely the regional community, is that it's essential for there to be progress in this situation for the few countries that are providing really tangible assistance to Maduro to be shamed into no longer doing it. I believe that the Maduro government has lasted as long as it has because of Russian support and Chinese financing, and that there has not been a sufficient cost for the foreign intervention of those countries into the domestic affairs of Venezuela. And I think that invoking the humanitarian crisis and highlighting the obstacle that the Maduro government provides to preventing Venezuelans from getting access to the food and medicine that they need would actually be a tangible.
And what happened with the situation with Al-Aissami, with Tarek Al-Aissami? He is now in Turkey, and we know that the uncle of Al-Aissami was the vice president of Saddam Hussein, and they have a family line in the Ba'ath, and they are involved too in the situation of Venezuela. How is going to work the international, because it's something that is right now in the situation of Venezuela. No, not everybody talks about that, but it's there.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know, Tarek Al-Aissami is the former
Vice president
of the country, and there's relatively well-documented ties to Iranian terrorist operations overseas. I'm not an expert in that particular area, but that would be yet another case of a country, a foreign military, or in this case, intelligence agency, which is interfering with domestic affairs of Venezuela, and which should be removed. Yes,
Expand more on what Canada should do to condemn governments or dictatorships like Cuba who are directly interfering in the affairs of Venezuela. You mentioned that Canada should sham those who are interfering, like Russia, China, but what about Cuba? Canada on the one side embraces the Castro dictatorship, which is the longest lasting dictatorship in the Americas, and yet it condemns the Maduro dictatorship, and they're both, one is the product of the other. One is directly running things in Venezuela. What's your comment on that?
So I no longer represent the government, and I don't speak for the government in any of what I've said today. I do know that when Canada has a productive relationship with a country like Cuba that does offer opportunities to attempt to advocate for changes in that country's policy. I've been out of the government for 2 years. I'm pretty sure that some of my former colleagues have thought of that already and have tried it, and clearly it's not making much progress on that front. In general, countries would shy away from criticizing how any other two other countries interact. So, for example, it would be abnormal for Canada to criticize how the United States is doing its policy towards Venezuela. I think it's required in this situation because the threats of military intervention by the Trump administration are actually consolidating support around Maduro and dividing the international community and preventing the effective international response that's required, as well as the Trump administration having lost all credibility in the defense of democracy and human rights overseas. So for those reasons, I believe there's a case to be made for Canada to explicitly criticize the United States. And I also believe that there's a case for us to hold Cuba to account for its intervention as well, and it would be inconsistent for us to adopt one standard for one country and not for the other. Obviously not exactly the same situations, but I do believe that it's important for the Venezuelan people to select the government that will rule over them, for them to have the ability to decide their own political future, and any country that comes between the Venezuelan people and their exercise of popular sovereignty should be held to account for that. Yes?
I think that you are very impacted to say that the way that we are. Tell me about. But beside that, my question is, I have two questions. Actually, three.
Actually,
I'm sorry for the audience, because maybe the numbers or whatever I've mentioned something that we as Canadians, we don't get too used to talk about that. We're going to talk about like between the sunshine, I mean, the 20 years that we have been with the Caribbean. I can say that approximately there are 500,000 people that have been killed.
500,000 from the humanitarian crisis?
No.
Oh.
The 20 years.
Oh, it's the whole period of the Maduro Chavez.
We can say yes.
Okay.
It's approximately there are 25,000 people being killed by a statistic that since 2007, I mean like 2 or 3 years after the government was taken, they killed the Statistic Institute because they don't want to show the reality. But let's use that number. We're talking about 500,000 people that have been killed. Formally, for them. My question is, what is the break point? I'm sorry that I'm going to break this, but what is the break point of death? Is that we're talking in this case, 41% of the population greater. Of the population, we have the same population in Canada. What is the number? Okay. In this case, you're mentioning, and I like that you're bringing that from a humanitarian crisis to a humanitarian catastrophe. That is another level. What is the trigger for you that, is it because of the issue of the electricity? Or because you think that it's going to increase the number of deaths?
Right. So
That's the first question.
Okay. So it's a tricky way of framing the problem, because if we consider other countries where there has been a humanitarian catastrophe, the international community has unfortunately demonstrated itself to be quite passive in the face of some astronomical body counts. I think primarily Syria, which was the country where R2P just founded. There have been, by any estimate, at least 200,000 people that have been killed in the 7 years of the Civil War, and it might also be 500,000. So something that's higher than what we're seeing in Venezuela, and yet there's been the absence of any kind of effective response in Syria. So I think the answer has to depend, there's no one sort of number. The answer obviously is measured by the response of the neighboring countries that no longer consider that acceptable. I was kind of grasping at an answer, I suppose, by trying to put a number to the death toll. I certainly was shocked to the core when I heard the calculation the first time that there were probably tens of thousands of people, or at that point it was thousands of people, and over the course of the 4 or 5 years of this humanitarian crisis, tens of thousands of people that had died. But of course, I did the math and learned how they calculated that. I realized it was true. There's something about being a diplomat from a fellow country in the Americas that thought maybe a few hundred people is terrible, but bad things happen. Once you get to tens of thousands in our part of the world, in this hemisphere, that kind of death toll, that seems harder to accept. And I've been in the Middle East as well, and I love the Arab world as well. But there's certainly, it's more familiar to have that kind of scale of human suffering in that part of the world. But to have it in our own neighborhood just seems, to me, it seems that we've already passed whatever that trigger is in Venezuela. And I hope that we'll be able to convince the rest of the world of that. Yes.
I will not give you my opinion on the views of the country because I know I will break down. As you
system, and she empowers these groups too.
Yeah.
So you have not only a structurized military, but you also have a paramilitary that is attacking the people systematically. And through that fear, they also induce more social control. You mentioned a lot the United States, okay?
Right.
The examples of Somalia and the Middle East. Would your position change if the intervention, humanitarian intervention, happened in support with Colombia, Brazil, the Antilles? Like that would change your perception of that?
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, you are talking about a diplomatic move. Diplomatic times are not the same as human times. So a diplomatic answer will end in thousands of people, tens of thousands of people dead at the same time.
Thank you for that question. My contention is that the military intervention is not an effective way to save lives, because it will kill more people than it saves. Now, that isn't a sufficient answer to how to save the lives of people that are dying right now, and I acknowledge that, and I apologize that I don't have a better answer. What I would say is that any military intervention should be accepted as legitimate by the people of Venezuela and by the international community, otherwise there are going to be long-term repercussions. It might be easier for me as a Canadian who's a step removed from it. It's not my family members that are suffering, but I do believe that Venezuela 5, 10, and 15 years from now will be a more peaceful place if the transition is accomplished peacefully and not militarily. I don't actually believe that military power is all that effective a form of power. What's the ideal, obviously, is the entire society uniting around a common course of action. There's nothing more terrifying to a dictator than to have his whole population rise up in opposition to him. The breadth of that political mobilization is far more powerful than what any military is able to muster. Now, there's obviously some things that the military can accomplish in a short order of time, but whenever you introduce violence into a situation, you immediately restrict the degree of support to a very narrow range. There are some very convincing analyses of regime change in 70 countries around the world that have been done by organizations by Freedom House that document how effective the military has been as a contributing factor to regime change. And the most successful changes have been ones that have that do not involve any military. And it's partially because as soon as the use of force is introduced, you shatter whatever consensus you might be able to create across society. So it may seem slow to build up that unity across the nation and across an international community, but it's actually far more powerful than a military. This is one reason why I've been so impressed with the Venezuelan people, with their ability to organize and to mobilize such a massive protest movement against Maduro peacefully. And I do see how the regime has retreated and has been forced to change its strategy over and over and over again, because the political leadership, the onus, the real drive of what's happening in Venezuela isn't with Maduro, it's actually with the people in the streets. That seems, to me, the most effective way to continue to be mobilizing in the streets, and the acts of massive civil disobedience will be more effective at bringing a change to this government than a foreign military, as well as the foreign military, then introducing all kinds of other